out their essays. I didn't get a chance to investigate it a bit further since it was the end of the hour. Now that he's on my radar, just like he was on Ms. McConnell's radar 1 and 2 months before. Now that he's on my radar, I'm noticing that some of his previous work that he's completed from earlier in the year leans a bit toward the violent side. I'm quoting, leans a bit toward the violent side. Now, I can bring down these things later today during my 5th hour prep if you would like them. This is it. That he's on my radar. I'm noticing that some of his previous work that he's completed from earlier in the year leans a bit toward the violent side. I'm quoting, leans a bit toward the violent side. Now, I can bring down these things later today during my 5th hour prep if you would like them. This is at 9:33 a.m. Now you have a kid looking on his phone. According to Ms. Cabina, when she was walking on Crumley's right-hand side in the classroom, handing out the essays that she had graded, Crumley had his phone in front of him with 2 hands on his phone, and she could clearly see what she testified was 8 or 9 different bullets on the screen. I asked her, what did you do? And she said, when I saw that, I put his essay down next to him on his desk, and I go, let me guess. He shut off his phone, he hid it, he turned it over. No. He didn't. No, he didn't. What does that tell you? It tells me that he wasn't interested in hiding it from me. Now, she, of course, spins that as something good. Well, if it was really doing something wrong, he would have wanted to hide it from me. Now, the answer is, as you all know, in many different situations, there could be many reasons why people do stuff all the time. And certainly what some folks will argue, and what I believe to be what any child psychologist and what our school experts will say is, he was calling out for help. He wanted to be caught. She never said a word to him. Passed out the essay. And then as he left the classroom, as class let out, she began thinking more about this, and clearly she was concerned. Her word, not mine. Clearly concerned. So what did she do? Well, she went into his past classwork. Why would a teacher do that? And the answer is because she was concerned. And in his previous classwork, he completed what she called an ELA survey, English Language Arts Survey. It's dated August 26, 2021. Okay, remember that date, August 26, 2021. That's probably the same date as the note card. We don't know for sure because the note card doesn't have a date on it, but the ELA survey and the note card, based on what Ms. Cabina's testified to, were given out at or about the same time. So it's early, first couple days of the school year. In the ELA survey, Ms. Cabina has testified under oath that there were major concerns that led her to say leans on the bit toward violent side. Number one, Ethan Crumley listed as his favorite book, Resistance and Making Bombs for Hitler. Resistance and Making Bombs for Hitler. She thought that suggested leaning toward the violent side. His 2 favorite TV shows listed were Dexter and Breaking Bad. Both highly violent with multiple murders, drugs, and related criminal bad behavior. She, in her testimony, thought those responses leaned toward the violent side. Her words, not mine. So now you have a teacher who saw these disturbing bullets on a phone, clearly in violation of school policy. Didn't intercede right away, but to her credit, at least at this point, she now is digging in to see, what else do I know about this kid? She then sends the email that I told you about to EJAC and Fine. When we deposed Mr. EJAC, when we deposed Ms. Fine, neither one of them ever recall seeing this ELA survey, even though Ms. Kabinski said, I can give it to you if you want later on. No follow-up. When they heard that information on Monday the 29th, ultimately, Ms. Cabina also sent a forwarding email to Mr. Hopkins saying, I sent this email to Fine and EJAC, but I want you to have the information as well. Now this kid is on Hopkins' radar as well. Hopkins now wanted to talk to Ethan Crumley, as did Ms. Fine. You've heard some of this during Hopkins' testimony in the preliminary examination hearing, day 2 of the Crumley parents. What we now know from Ms. Fine and Mr. Hopkins is what they had in front of them at the time was nothing. They didn't ask to see his phone and show me the bullets you were looking at. They didn't ask Ms. Kabinski for any more information. They didn't go to Ethan's classmates who were in the room with him while he's looking at bullets to see if they noticed or heard anything. They spoke to him, and the two of them concluded, okay, he's sorry, he realizes he screwed up and can't look at that stuff at school. He's just another Oxford kid. I'm putting that in air quotes because this is what I've heard now for 2 weeks under sworn deposition testimony. Just another Oxford kid who likes guns. It's completely normal behavior, allegedly, which is a lie. Had somebody truly wanted to investigate what was going on, one of the things that any good investigator would do is talk to certain classmates to see if they saw bullets. Did they see anything else on his phone that he was looking at? Has he said anything to you? Have you heard anything? Here's what they would have found out had they done that, like the Oakland County Sheriff Department did after the shooting. One of Ethan Crumley's classmates has told the Oakland County Sheriff Department that on or about the 25th, which is the Thursday before the shooting on Tuesday, that Ethan told him, if I ever tell you not to come to school sometime, don't. Now, this is a young kid talking to another young kid. So this young kid didn't know what to do with that information and thought Ethan was kidding. The next day, Crumley showed this person pictures of his gun and the target that he shot that was on his Instagram account. Well, from our review, the target he's talking about in the Instagram account was probably that Sunday where he went shooting with his mom, as you all recall, with Ethan's new gun, which of course he can't have a gun because he's under the age of 18, and they went shooting. Again, this young man couldn't say if that was that Friday, the 26th, or Monday, the 29th. But on the 29th, same morning that Ms. Kabinski saw the ELA responses and sent the email, we know that this person saw Crumley in the hallway as part of Ms. Kabinski's class. They went to the hallway and then came in. It was a process that they were doing. It's one of the ways that she takes roll call, if you will, and checks papers and so forth. And showed him a single bullet that he pulled out of his pocket. Apparently, this person said to Ethan, you know, what the hell are you doing? Put it away. You're not supposed to have that stuff at school. But again, Ethan really hadn't done or said anything to this kid, and this kid didn't know what to do. So he didn't say anything to anybody. But imagine had one of the adults, the teachers, the counselors, the assistant principal, the dean of students, done their job. This information would have been known on that Monday. And we're not even close to being done on that Monday. On the 29th, Ms. Cabina never heard from Hopkins, from EJAC, or Fine. So she had no way of knowing whether they truly met with Ethan that day or not. She's so concerned about his past responsing, leaning toward violent, and seeing bullets on this phone that she's writing them an email, and not one of these three individuals get back to her and tell her, handled, spoke to them, picked their brain, picked her brain for more information, nothing. So what did Ms. Cabina do? Later on that day, shortly before the end of school, she sent Hopkins and Fine an email. Now, sadly, she didn't send it to EJAC, because that was the third prong of who she sent before, but she didn't. And so what I'm about to share with you, Mr. EJAC testified in his deposition. He never heard any of this until I showed it to him in his deposition. Imagine that. Imagine if there was a real investigation done by Oxford Community Schools, that maybe somebody would have stumbled across this before and had a discussion with him. Ms. Kabinski wrote to Fine and Hopkins, who now, by the way, met with Ethan. He explained everything, seemed sorry, so they thought everything was fine. They never looked at the ELA assignment and those responses. Just everything's fine now. She now sends him this email at 3:21, so after school, shortly after school. And what does she send them? But pictures. Show again, please, of the note card, Chelsea. And then go to page 2. Crumley's answers to 3 questions that are on the back side of the note card. Now, I'll discuss the pictures again in a minute, but Ms. Kubinski testified that she was very concerned about answers 2 and 3. Do you have that? All right. He was asked who his favorite teacher was last year in language arts, and he listed a teacher's name. He was asked, what's a word or phrase that describes the last 18 months? His word was enjoyable. Now, mind you, this is August and now November of 2021. Last 18 months includes the global pandemic and homeschool. Enjoyable. She thought that was concerning. And what's one of your pet peeves? He, Crumley, wrote, when people don't do what I ask them to do. She thought answers 2 and 3 were concerned. In her email, though, she describes the pictures. And here's what the email says in pertinent part. I just wanted to send you what I discovered about Ethan that I hadn't noticed up to this point. Pictures below. So she attached them. I normally have students fill out note cards at the beginning of the year, and generally, I usually just read through the back. Those are those 3 answers. And keep them for activities that require volunteers in the future. However, after discovering what Ethan was looking at today in class, his phone with bullets, she's not done. That's how concerned she was. After discovering what Ethan was looking at today in class, this seemed to correlate, correspond, be similar. Words that are obvious, that they now explain, well, wait a minute, they're not consistent at all. They were when you wrote this email. What she doesn't do is describe the picture, but she attached it. Again, Ms. Cabina testified that at this time, on the 29th, she went back and saw this picture that she admits is from one of the first days of school, and that she could see the firearm erased. The remnants of the lines were still there. Again, she testified under oath that although she thought that might be a building drawn to the left, it also certainly could be a magazine full of bullets, like at the top, that clearly you can see. She sent this to Fine and Hopkins, thinking that they would see this and join her in their concern. Yet, Mr. Hopkins testified, and Ms. Fine testified, when they look at that, they didn't see anything wrong at all. They didn't see a gun. No one ever told them there was a gun drawn before there. They couldn't see that the gun was there on the picture, and that thing to the left clearly does not look anything like a gun magazine today that they're aware of. So this picture that was sent to them out of concern by the teacher was completely blown off by the people that had already met with Ethan Crumley that day. Again, no follow-up, not just with Ethan Crumley, folks, but when Fine and Hopkins got the photographs that they now know Ms. Kabinski is so worried about because they correlate with the previous concern that leaned toward violence. They don't even call her up and talk to her. They don't go interview her. They don't ask her anything about, what's your concern? Tell me what's going on here. All she's doing is keep emailing them, and all they do is blow it off. We now go to Tuesday morning, November 30, the morning of the shooting. Ejak testified that that's when he thinks he saw the picture for the first time, and it meant absolutely nothing to him because he didn't see a gun, didn't think that was a magazine, so played no role in anything. What we now know is Ms. Kabinski in first hour has a special ed teacher, Ms. Karpinski, who sits in the classroom for various days. We now know that that morning, on the 30th, Ms. Karpinski actually sent an email to Hopkins and Fine. Grab it. Saying, I know Jackie, Ms. Kabinski, emailed you guys yesterday with some concerns, her word, about Ethan Crumley in our first hour class. Today he's watching videos on his phone of a guy gunning down people. Watching videos on his phone of a guy gunning down people. It looks like a movie scene and not security footage / a real event, but definitely concerning when taking into account some of his other behaviors. Definitely concerning when taking into account some of his other behaviors. Oh, you mean like looking at bullets on the phone? Oh, you mean like the drawings that have been forwarded that no one's looking at and doing anything about? Hopkins testified that he never even saw this email until after he got an email about a half hour later from Ms. Morgan, the math teacher. Ms. Fine got the email, and ultimately her testimony is she understood that Hopkins was on it, so nothing was merited from her end. Everybody assuming that everybody else is doing something and no one's doing anything. Ms. Morgan sent an email to the same folks, and you all have seen as part of the preliminary examination materials, the math homework drawings, which I thought everybody in the free world would openly admit are highly concerning until I start taking depositions of these folks from Oxford Community Schools, because it's not concerning at all. It's no big deal that he drew a firearm that, by the way, looks like his gun that Mommy and Daddy just purchased for him. It's no big deal that there's a bullet above which is written blood everywhere. It's no big deal that a person is got clearly 2 gunshot wounds, not even a stick person, a person, with blood coming out. According to Mr. Hopkins, he didn't even know that was blood. He didn't see the gunshot in the person. I mean, guys, you can't make this stuff up. The thoughts won't stop, help me. My life is useless. The world is dead. According to according to Mr. Hopkins, the only thing out of all of that that's concerning, because kids in Oxford have guns, that's their defense in this case, because kids in Oxford have guns, was the thoughts won't stop, help me. Well, what thoughts, folks? Thoughts of what? Well, we know what thoughts of what. We can see them. That was the only one that bothered him. So he thought the kid might need help. What kind of help? Mental help. So what happened? Mr. Ejak and Mr. Hopkins got involved when Ms. Morgan, the math teacher, was so concerned about these drawings and these statements that she took a picture on her phone and marched it down to the office and showed it to them. What else do they need? Hopkins goes down and now gets Ethan out of class. Where's the backpack? On the back of his chair. They go back to the office, and that's where they have about a half hour to 45-minute conversation with Hopkins, Ejak, and Crumley. Hopkins says the only thing he really asked Ethan about, Crumley about, were the thoughts won't stop, help me. And the rest were all video games because, of course, Ethan Crumley is going to be the video game designer dude. And everything else is just fine and completely normal in Oxford. That's paraphrasing, but that's their defense and that's the testimony. Mom and Dad Crumley get called. In the middle of all this, Ethan is now really worried about missing chemistry class, so he wants his homework. He wants his backpack. They went down, Hopkins did, to the classroom and got the backpack. Ms. Morgan, apparently, according to Hopkins' testimony, picked it up, and he said it looked like nothing. She handed it to me, and I went, whoa, and made a comment out loud about how heavy the backpack was. Well, we know what's in that backpack. Gun, magazines, and his journal, the manifesto. Hopkins takes the backpack, takes it back to where, I said Hopkins, Ejak took the backpack and gave it back to Ethan Crumley, right in front of Hopkins, and neither one of them, according to their testimony, even thought for a second to search the backpack. Neither one of them thought for a second to ask Ethan, hey dude, show us what's in there. We just want to make sure everything's cool. Didn't even ask him. And what you're going to hear, folks, is their, in my opinion, pack of lies that they can't look at a kid's backpack. Ask these folks about what they know from their own kids of what backpacks are searched for. They're searched all the time for cigarettes, for vapes, for dope, you name it. But they didn't have reasonable cause to suspect, like they're police officers. How about, I asked him, just ask the kid for his permission. Never did. Gave it to him. So he's working on his chemistry homework, and that tells Hopkins that everything's cool, and he's thinking like a normal kid that he's worried about classes. Now he's worried about them finding it. Mom and Dad come in. You all have heard a lot about Mom and Dad come in. Well, let me just tell you this. Apparently, none of you were listening at the preliminary examination when you heard how neglectful the parents were. Remember that? Parents, they called a number of times. They had difficulty getting through. Parents came in, no hugs, no kisses, no greetings, wouldn't take them out for therapy. Neglectful. Well, that was in the criminal trial. Now, because one of the things we're suing them for is not reporting to Child Protective Services neglectful parents, now it's, oh no, they were pretty cool. They didn't do anything out of the, it was a little out of the ordinary, but they weren't neglectful. Because they know now that if they admit that it's neglectful, that they violated the Child Protection Act by not reporting because they're mandatory reporters, and they all admit they're mandatory reporters. 2 different tunes, 2 different days, all sworn testimony. Mom and Dad come in, they have their discussion. Hopkins give them a handout with like 60 or 70 different therapists and local organizations to assist in mental health. Made it very clear, according to Hopkins, that I wanted this kid seen today. And you remembered the preliminary examination, you heard about suicidal. He had suicidal ideations, thoughts of suicide. Well, now in our deposition, he wasn't suicidal at all. Why? Because he knows if he was, if he probably were, then Hopkins is on the hook for not reporting it to the authorities, Child Protective Services. Never called to the principal. Never called Deputy Lewert, who was an Oakland County Sheriff deputy that is the liaison officer, they call him an SRO, and I forget what the acronym is, in school. Never called him. Never said anything to him at all. So when Mom and Dad say, we're too busy to take him for help today, Hopkins says, get him help within 48 hours, and he testified this part, similar to what he said to on the witness stand in the preliminary examination in the criminal case. If they wouldn't have followed up in 48 hours, then I would have reported them to CPS. Oh, but not 2 days before, when he's got drawings on 2 different things and violent tendencies and concerns by 4 different teachers, or 3 teachers 4 different times in 2 days. Sent back to class. He goes back to class somewhere around 11 o'clock. And now we know it started at 12:51, just before 1, 2 hours later. To hear adults, to hear teachers, to hear school administrators be sworn to tell the truth across the table from me and my team, and tell me that these things aren't concerning, just normal behavior for kids from Oxford. Nothing's concerning about bullet holes in a guy with blood everywhere, 2 different drawings of a firearm in school, looking at bullets on a phone. Ladies and gentlemen, I can't think of anything more grotesque and concerning. Apparently, the only thing that was going to stop Ethan Crumley from the school's perspective that day was if he would have handed them his manifesto and just said, why don't you read what I'm going to do today? Were there signs beforehand? Answer, yes. Were there signs in the days before only to people who were paying attention and who did actually follow up about concerns raised about a student? Were there warning signs? There were stop signs everywhere on Monday the 29th and Tuesday the 30th that were absolutely ignored. And now what you have is a school district who, because they have shirked their responsibility, everything I just shared with these folks should have come from the school district, not me or the attorneys fighting on behalf of the victims. So, what's next? There's a number of other depositions that we need to take, and we will be taking. And some of them will be obviously school administrators. Obviously, if the school district fights us on that, we will, of course, be in court, and we'll let you folks know. We're going to be taking the depositions of folks that should have been notified, like Deputy Lewert, principal, superintendent. It probably won't surprise any of you to know now that new policies and procedures in this school, in this school district, include teachers, administrators should look for violent writings and drawings. I mean the ones that didn't mean anything to you at the time, now a part of the official policy. And when they see this stuff, they must notify who? The principal? You mean the one that you never notified? Who else needs to be notified? The SRO? You mean like Deputy Leward? Yeah, that guy? You mean the ones that you didn't notify on this day because there's nothing concerning here? So the negligence, the gross negligence of this school district is overwhelming, and we're not done yet. But since publicly this school district has absolutely hidden this from not just these folks, but every parent of every child in that district, we, on behalf of all my clients, feel an obligation to those folks, to people in the public in general, and hopefully to school administrators and counselors, hopefully all over the world, that signs exist if you look for them and just don't blow it off and assume everything's okay. It is incumbent on the folks where our kids spend the majority of their days, think about it, in the school, that they be on the lookout for all types of behavior, good and bad. And when it's concerning because of leans toward violent, you mean like violent toward people or himself, that it result in what the system requires, and that's reporting to the Child Protective Services, to the principal, to the safety or security officers at school who are armed, so they can make a determination of what is going on. What needed to happen is the next question. Call the police. Let the police deal with it. What if it turns out he really is just this video game designer extraordinaire? That's their job to investigate. That's why you have reasonable cause to suspect. It was everywhere in this case. Both of these drawings, all of these various statements, this conduct, reasonable cause to suspect. Doesn't mean you need to go into court and prove it. That's other people's job. Their job is to report it. So what we're hoping is by sharing this information with the public that we can once and for all begin to have an understanding of what went wrong and by whom and what needs to happen in the future so this never happens in Oxford or any other place in the world. That's our hope. That is our goal. Before I conclude, I'm going to obviously answer questions, allow questions of my clients. We do not forget. Every single time we're before you, we remind you. These folks are about full accountability. Yes, we've already sued Ethan Crumley. Yes, we sued Mom and Dad, Mr. and Mrs. Crumley. They're still in it, guys, and we're not saying they're not responsible as well. But missing in all of this has been the school stepping up and doing, think about Uvalde, God forbid, Texas. Think about how much information we all had. I'm sitting 48 hours after that horrible tragedy. I'm seeing the governor of Texas, who I'm no big fan of, by the way, and the #1 law enforcement guy of Texas show video of what the officers did wrong and call out the chief, captain, whoever it was, by name and take action against him within a week, and compare that to what Oxford Community Schools has done here in this case. It is a perfect example of actually what normally happens. You hide the information and you hope it all just blows over. This ain't blowing over. These people, my office, us, and all the other attorneys working on behalf of the victims are not going to let this get swept under the rug. Questions? Simon.
Question for Jill. What do you hope people take away from listening to the emails, watching these images, and reflecting on what happened?
First off, unfortunately, this wasn't the first school shooting. So I don't see any excuse to not take these red flags very seriously. And again, to me, this is beyond neglect. It's unforgivable. We have 4 angels that they're gone. I can't find an excuse for dropping the ball again and again and again. We're learning all of these months later that this could have and should have been avoided. These children should be with us here today. There's no excuse. Anyone with any type of common sense could put the pieces together that something was very wrong. And I hope that everybody takes away from this, if you have anything to do with children, if you're in any position of authority, if you see these signs, do something. I don't care if you're in a meeting and you send an email and there's miscommunication and nobody knows what's going on. There's no excuse. Do something. Call the police. Call CPS. Better safe than sorry, because again, these school shootings keep happening again and again. And so very often they could have been and they should have been prevented. So I would like people to take that away. If you see something, say something.
And Jill, to add on to that, if you're not getting an adequate response, which clearly these teachers weren't, then step it up
That's
to
right.
another level. We call it, the, if you will, the chain of command, okay? So on all the emails that I've discussed today, ain't nothing to Mr. Wolf. Ain't nothing to Deputy Lewert on the ones that we've discussed today. There's more. We'll talk more later.
Just follow-up question for Buck, if I can. It certainly takes so much courage to be up here and to talk about this subject, but want to ask you, to you, what does accountability from the school district look like to you?
That's a loaded question. You know, as I'm, this is the first time that we're hearing this right here. Ven didn't go over this with us, right? So I'm jotting some notes down as we're cruising along here. So accountability, to me, if you look at every step of this, okay, with the teachers sending these emails, okay, internally, why weren't they not contacting CPS? Number one. Number two is, if you look at these emails that are sent by the teachers, there's no consistency on who the emails are going to. So that tells me that there's not a process in place to attack something like this. There's no process. We got emails that are going to Hopkins, emails that are going to EJAC and fine, Hopkins left off, now we're back on Hopkins fine. Like, these teachers don't know who to send emails to, or they didn't execute. They weren't trained on it, they didn't execute. Something, I don't know, we'll figure out as we get further into this, right? But accountability, it looks to me like how it looks, just how it does, ask my boys at home what they think accountability is. It's owning what you do. That's all it is. Sometimes you don't like to have accountability. Own what you do every day. Wear it. I think it's completely obvious what Ven, was that 3 depositions or 4 that you done?
We've done 5 or 6.
5 or 6?
With many more to go.
Okay, and this, we're just finding this, we're just scratching the surface. It's blatantly obvious that Oxford Community Schools is withholding information. They know that they dropped the ball that day. At every level. That's why they're hiding it. I mean, hopefully our community's starting to see this. It's ridiculous. Okay, meanwhile, here we are. Buying memorial shirts for our murdered kid, right? What's Oxford Community Schools doing? Nothing. Nothing. They're just withholding information. They're hiding behind governmental immunity and Mullins. And I'm just curious to, you know, as we dig deeper into this, you know, some questions that I have is culture at Oxford Community Schools. Why did the teachers not report this to CPS? Is there something in the culture there that's telling them not to? I don't know, right? But obviously the culture is not good there, because there is signs everywhere. There's signs. Everybody's heard that song, right? There's signs everywhere. And nobody did a thing.
This could be for anyone, but then you talked about what the school district has done now, considering new safety protocols in place. And Buck and Mrs. Muir, you could answer this as well. Do you consider that what they've done an admission of guilt of what they did wrong that day?
100%. 8400A? Yep, that's their silent admission of guilt. They slipped that right under the radar and put it in. Absolutely.
They're adopting a plan, if you will, that's being used by pretty much everybody now, including Homeland Security. And that's what, when you go through the plan, Jason, to answer your question directly, yeah, you lose count on how many things, had they done that here, would have resulted in them catching and detecting Ethan Crumley before. So absolutely yes. It's an interesting question, legal question I'll bore you with later, because we'll be fighting about trying to get that into evidence in trial, and there will be the defense arguing that shouldn't come in because it's after the fact. It's called a subsequent remedial measure, but I'll bore you with that legal stuff later on. But answer your questions, absolutely, it is an admission that they missed all these things.
By the way, Buck, do you consider the recent resignations on the school board part of that accountability?
Well, I think, so those two members that resigned finally decided to talk to the community. And there's some folks in our community that are doing a whole lot of work here behind the scenes, trying to drive for accountability. And I think they've been fed propaganda. Okay, the school board has been fed propaganda by Oxford Community Schools and their attorney. They weren't allowed to ask questions. They weren't allowed to dig deep. So when these two members stepped away and started listening to the community, it became blatantly obvious that Oxford Community Schools is covering this up. So I think they thought, I'm guessing, I haven't talked to them, but I'm guessing they're parents, and they want, what if this hit their house? And I think at the end of the day, they're going to step away. Their moral compass is probably higher than what we want to give them credit for, because they stood behind this cover-up for 10 months. But I think that for sure speaks volumes of what they're seeing now. Absolutely.
There's a doctrine under Michigan law, folks, called in loco, L-O-C-O, parenti, P-A-R-E-N-T-I. In loco parenti means that certain people act as parents on behalf of kids in certain circumstances. At school, kids under the age of 18, teachers, principals, counselors are in loco parenti. They're acting as parents on behalf of these kids. Can you imagine, Jill, Megan, Buck, Sherry, what they would have done if they would have gotten the drawing from the beginning of the year, knowing that their kid is in that school? Of course they would have done something. That's what parents do. We're proactive. Imagine if this kid is in your house and he draws this in your house. What would you do? You would call the authorities. Even if he didn't do something wrong, I don't know what to do. You'd probably call his parents first, and if you didn't get an adequate response, I'm guessing you call somebody else, like the police. Let them figure this out. Something's going on here. So when we're talking about what should have been done, and by the way, in loco parenti is actually in the handbook at Oxford Community Schools. So they were taught about it. The teachers all testified, to go to a point Buck just made, that they can't just report this up the chain to the counselors and so forth. They have an obligation as a mandatory reporter to notify Child Protective Services if they have reasonable cause to suspect. They all admit it. So then Buck, I think, put it perfectly. Then why didn't they? They did not do their job under the law.
You've led to my question. At what point, where does the buck stop? Meaning, a teacher sees a drawing,
Yep.
reports to counselors,
Right.
thinks they maybe have done the right thing,
Correct.
doesn't want to necessarily take a student and make life difficult for them reports it up the chain.
Right.
Cumulatively, where do you, you know, you're assessing the blame everywhere, and I don't mean to sound insensitive. If I were up there, I would feel the same. But it's a hard line to draw. Or are you saying today every teacher in Michigan sees a drawing should pull a kid on their own accord?
This drawing? Yes. 2 drawings? Yes. My life is useless? Yes. With a dead body bleeding all over? Yes. I am saying that. And anyone that says differently shouldn't be teaching. I come from 2 public school teachers, one who was a principal more than a teacher, and a teacher. Without any question, I promised my dad rolling over in his grave as a principal. He'd want to know everything going on in his school. Let him make that call. Absolutely, he's going to talk to that kid, and he's going to seek help. No one's saying have him arrested. That's their job to figure out whether he broke any laws or if there is a concern. But to try to make it so the issue so big to respond to your criticism, and it's fair, great question. And is it just everybody's at fault all the time? No. Under these facts, not a close call. I don't care what anybody says. If a kid is drawing firearms on his homework, if he's looking at bullets on his phone, something is going on that ain't good. Let the experts figure it out. And the experts apparently, sadly, were not in that counseling office.
My last question is in regard to the meeting that was held the day of the shootings. Is there anything other information that you can flush out of what you've been able to gather in your interviews in regard to that meeting was about a half hour? Nobody, did the administration know that the family had purchased a gun and he had been to a fire? I mean, all of this is unknown to them. I'm going toward why nobody looked in the backpack. What happened in that meeting if that wasn't, if we've got information and drawings of guns, et cetera, nobody bothered, and I know you've addressed this, but if you can add more texture to what happened in that meeting.